Hello and welcome to Pickles Garage. Today I wanted to go over some basic tools for any starting backyard mechanic. So these are the exact essentials that I've found you will need to cover a vast majority of the jobs that you're working on. And then I'll kind of go in stages from this point about tools that you should consider getting next. But I did want to go over this just because I know a lot of people are interested in saving money on working on their own things, but it's very easy to fall down the rabbit hole of which tools do I need to buy, all these gimmicky sort of tools, which I'll go over later as well, and what is the best to cover a majority of what I need. So I'll start first with probably the very most important. This should be your essentially day one. This is sort of your buy-in. It's going to be a lot of kits like this. This is specifically a Craftsman. You can get DeWalt, you can get all kinds of different companies, but what I would recommend is you get one that has a lifetime warranty. Craftsman, of course, worked through Sears for a while, and you can get things repaired and replaced, and now you can go direct as well. But just if you can find one that has the warranty that's good quality, it is probably going to be in excess of $100. But again, don't cheap out on this. This is going to last you more than essentially anything else that I'm going to show you. But one other piece of advice, always put your tools back. I'm missing some here, but I know exactly where they are. I'm working on a couple different projects at a time right now. But that is my best piece of advice. If you're going to work on something, always put it back. But this comes with all your different sockets, metric, standard, different ratchet sizes. It does come with some extensions as well as your wrenches. So this gives you everything you're essentially ever going to need for a vast majority of your jobs here. So this is certainly the most important to go ahead and buy first. Now, next you'll see I have a jack next to it. Most vehicles will have some sort of cheap, sort of scissory jack. Those are useful in a pinch, but they are more or less an emergency thing, right? And so if you're broke down on the side of the road, perfect example, but they're meant to be light, folded away, and only used a couple times a year. So a jack is going to be your next most important thing. They can be a little bit expensive. They can be $100, $200, $300. This is one of the more expensive ones that you'd see in, a garage or something like that. They do have smaller ones that are a little bit more compact that you could put in a trunk, but from my experience, they haven't lasted as long. When I was regularly using them, like I do this one, those smaller ones would last maybe a year, year and a half. This one I've had for several years now and haven't had any issues with it. I could be better about servicing it, but even when I don't, it just works. And along those same lines, you have these. So the jack stand's also incredibly important. This is great for lifting up the vehicle, but you don't necessarily want to rely on it. It is a hydraulic system, so if it loses pressure, it's going to go ahead and fall. So you're going to want something like this in order to make sure that you can prop up your vehicle safely. They usually sell in sets of 2 or 4, but those are essentially the 3 most essential items. Next, we have your standard Phillips screwdrivers. You're going to need that for a variety of jobs. You'll use this less than you expect. Honestly, you're going to use sockets more than anything for most jobs, but it is important just to have a basic set. This you can more or less cheap out on if you want to go for a little bit lower end. These, they could break, whatever. I wouldn't worry about the lifetime warranty necessarily. You can, but if you're looking to overall save money on the screwdrivers, not the ratchet, jack, and jack stand. So that would be kind of your next item. You're also going to need a set of basic pliers. Again, that's not going to be something that you're using on a regular basis, but it is going to be very helpful for those instances where you do need it. Most important of this image right here are going to be these breaker bars. These are going to save you from breaking the ratchets that you just spent a bunch of money on. They're relatively cheap, about 20 bucks or so, but you're going to want to use that on anything that you feel like you have to put your full weight into, or you're using kind of 80% or more of your strength. You're going to want to use the breaker bars, not the ratchet, because you don't want to break the teeth on those and then have to use that warranty I mentioned earlier. The other thing with these is you can use a sort of cheater bar. Now, this isn't necessarily a specific tool that you can buy. It's something you kind of have to make in some cases, but it's just a piece of pipe that you go ahead and put on the end of your breaker bar, and that gives you a lot more leverage. You'll use this configuration probably more than anything. You're getting a tire off if you're working on a older bolt on something on the frame or anything like that. This is going to save you so much time and headache and damage to your muscles potentially. So definitely try and find something like this. This one came off an old broom, and essentially I just cut it in half, and I've been using this for probably upwards of 5 years and haven't really had any issues with it. So highly recommended. I'm sure there's specific tools out there that you can buy that are designed to be that sort of use case, but I've found no issues with kind of DIYing it yourself by cutting a broom or whatever else. The other thing is this soft sledge. So it is kind of funny to think that you would use a hammer when you're working on cars, but the thing is you will for some different things. I've seen some people use hammers to hit that extra turn or that initial turn when they're using a breaker bar. That's okay, but the thing is, if you use a sort of standard claw hammer, metal hammer, then one, it will kind of damage your arm a little bit, your muscles, just because there's no, you'll feel a rebound, whereas this absorbs, right? And so rather than having a bounce back like you would see if you were hitting a normal hammer, this absorbs that hit, and so that, one, it's not going to fly back and hit you in the face, and two, you're going to do a lot less damage to your arms, joints, and whatnot. So it is something that I use, somewhat often. It is helpful in a lot of cases, but if you're looking at all these as stage one, this would probably be one of the last items. Definitely start with this, and breaker bars actually, and then go ahead and do screwdrivers. But again, this is so cheap, this is usually something that's just kind of, you'll either have this already or it's just bought along the way. Next step here, this is kind of a transition step. So that was your first items that you should get once you start getting into working on things yourself. Next items are going to be a decent light. I'll admit I don't use this enough as I should, but I also don't often work in a garage. If I was in a garage more often, it was a little darker, then I would probably get a lot more use out of having a light. But because I work outside, it's pretty bright here, I haven't really had an issue with not being able to see. So that's why this is kind of a transition-y sort of tool. This one specifically is a Warsun. I think I got it on Amazon for, I don't know, in the neighborhood of like 20 bucks or something. They're not super expensive. These are an absolute lifesaver. Everyone drops bolts, everyone. You can try and be as careful as you want, but things roll and, slip and fall, and this will save you a lot of headache. Especially, I've worked on engines before where, rods have dropped, and I've been able to use a magnet rather than taking off the entire intake and getting those out. So absolute lifesaver. Definitely get a magnet. Now this next part, I will say, is going to be sort of your, you've been doing it for a little while, you want to make your life a little easier. These are definitely the tools to consider next. Now, I love to use just ratchets. I like to be, involved in my repairs, I guess you could say. And so for a very long time, I was very anti impact. I didn't enjoy it. Usually I was working on cars as, a hobby, and I just felt like the impact kind of cheapened it a little bit. But the more often you're working on cars, the more often you're going to be like, you know what, I could skip this. I don't really need to feel every, turn for this bolt. And so very recently I did start getting into the impact. This one, Ryobi, I wouldn't necessarily recommend. I think it's a great sort of entry-level impact. I bought it just because I had other Ryobi stuff, but there's better ones that you can get a lot more torque on. For the most part, I have to break a bolt loose and then I have to use my impact, which kind of defeats the purpose. A lot of people are using impacts just because they don't have a lot of room, a lot of space, and they don't want to do the full turning. But these can get quite expensive, so that's why this is definitely a stage 2. And if you are going to get an impact, you cannot use chrome sockets. You're going to have to get your own socket set. These are also expensive. This is like $100 as well. And so you're going to want to make sure that you have, some decent sockets for your impact. That way you can get a lot of use out of it. This has standard, metric. On the other side of that is just more of these. And it's very helpful. You have extensions, you have this sort of angle as well. And so it's definitely very useful, and I have gotten a ton of jobs done a lot faster just because of it. So I definitely appreciate them more now than I did initially. These are kind of like a sticky situation sort of tool. Essentially, you just put your ratchet in this, and they're called like crow's feet. And so you get kind of a different angle on a tool, rather than if this was a full wrench, then you wouldn't have as much room. I would say this is stage 2 just because there's been plenty of situations where this has been a lifesaver, but it's also not something that I use on a regular basis. It's like that one random bolt on a header at the very back of the engine that I absolutely need this for and can't do it otherwise. But the rest of the time, you're not going to want to use it just because the weird angle that you're working at, usually it'll try and kind of like shear off. It'll like flop this way just because the direction that you're torquing it, it'll just sort of like, like that. And so these are definitely helpful, but certainly a stage 2. This is probably one of my favorite tools that I have. It's just a, shorty ratchet, but it has, angle ability. And so when you're working in an engine bay, if you have like a full-size ratchet, it's pretty difficult to sort of maneuver and get into those tight spaces. This is an absolute lifesaver. It's got tons of teeth, and so tiny little turns I can do with it will make a big difference. So this is one of my favorite things. Also Craftsman, absolutely one of my favorite. There's the part number. That's how much I like it. I want you guys to get the exact same thing because you will love it. Finally, for ratchets on this stage 2 is going to be the long ratchet. This is also a lifesaver. Now, I wouldn't treat this like a breaker bar. There are actually ratcheting breaker bars. This is just a ratchet that's long. And the reason why that's so great is because you can get way more torque, a lot less strain on yourself to try and get that motion. But a lot of the different parts of the vehicle that you're going to be working on, you'll have plenty of room. And this just makes it way easier to break things loose, to get things tightened. And it's just an all-around great tool. There's tons of different ones. I've had some from Husky, and this one is literally just a generic one I got on Amazon as well. Nico looks like. But I would say any one that you're going to get is going to be pretty decent. And again, these aren't that expensive either. But this goes hand in hand with that. I use these two almost more than anything, but it's kind of a luxury item. That's why I kind of recommend it stage 2. It's a little bit of a luxury item, but once you have these, it's so hard to go back. Now, other people are going to probably consider vice grips or crescents or anything like that as some of your essential items, but really, again, this is sort of a luxury of like, okay, I don't want to look for the specific tool, so I'm going to go ahead and match it to this, locks in place, and go from there. But you kind of miss out on learning a little bit about what a certain bolt looks like in the certain sizes. And because this is usually only 2 contact points, it's not really great for your bolts. Same thing with a vice grip. Like, yeah, you can absolutely vice grip every bolt that you ever work on, but you'll hate yourself down the road when you find a bolt that's all chewed up and you can't really work with it anymore, or it shears off. So this is like, if I'm using this on something, it's usually because I'm removing it to get rid of it entirely. I'm never going to try and put it back on. Or if I'm trying to grip onto like a bar or something, like you may have seen in different Jeep videos that I've done where I've replaced the front end. I just had to hold things in place with this. And so it is a useful tool, but it's certainly not something you should be using on bolts if you can avoid it. Because again, unless it's already destroyed, already, you know, rusted out, you don't want to do any further damage to it with this thing. Same thing here. This is basically the same thing as this tool, except this one, like I said, locks in place. Although it does have this sort of point at the end, and so if you're kind of pulling or adjusting things through a hole, that is helpful as well. So I do like this one. I do use this one fairly often, but if I can help it, I'll always try and get the wrench. Now, you did see different wrenches in this initial kit. Naturally, this is a very basic level, so I would say you should get additional ones, larger sizes and whatnot. That kind of goes hand in hand with what you're getting out of this kit. And so at this stage, if you're going to get more wrenches, larger sizes, that would definitely be stage 2 as well. Now, this is going to be your wobble extensions. So wobble extensions, very similar to any other extension. You know, you get a lot of room if you're working on it, but the beauty about these things is because they're cut a certain way here, you can actually not have the socket in all the way flush. And so you'll have it popped out a little bit, and that allows it to give you sort of like edge, right? And so, whereas this is helpful because you can kind of turn it and you can work on it from that angle, this works in a very similar way where it doesn't fully seat itself. Let me grab one. Doesn't fully seat itself, like that would be the fully seated, but if you pop it out slightly, now I can work at that angle. And I still have just as much control over it as I would if it was all the way flush. So I thoroughly enjoy wobble extensions. I have 100% been saved by having them. There's been absolutely situations where I wasn't able to come at it at a straight angle, and the wobble extension was what solved my issue. And again, put your tools back. Again, I'm working on a different project that required those that are missing. Now we get into a little bit more of stuff that's very helpful and you'll absolutely use it, but you're probably not going to use it as much as you think you would. That's going to be these creepers. I have tons of them. I think I have like 3 different ones, and they always sound like an amazing thing that I'm going to use constantly, but it takes one time for you to be on your back on this under a vehicle trying to crank a bolt off, and this thing is rolling around while you're trying to do so, and you're trying to like hold with your feet in place just so you can sort of get that edge, but it's skating, and then you know you hit those expansion lines in your concrete and you can't get over it, or you hit a rock and you're already frustrated because of whatever you're working on, for you to just absolutely hate these. So I do love creepers, but I love the idea of creepers more than the actual practicality. I work on my back way more than I do with a creeper, because the other thing is you're going to need to raise the car a little bit higher. You're going to run into things. You know, there's certain vehicles I have where I don't even need to lift it to work on it underneath if I just crawl underneath. But if I try and use a creeper, even this extremely low one, this one's designed to be extremely low, I still am not able to get into it. So again, I think everyone should have one at some point, but it wouldn't be my first purchase, just because you see maybe like a lot of mechanics, definitely in TV shows, are rolling out from under the vehicle. I spend way more time just without it. So that is an important note on those. These, love these. I use this probably more than I should on a lot of different things. This is when you start getting into a little bit more, you know, intense repairs. Essentially what this is this point, you'll crank it and you'll turn it, and these claws will hold whatever you're trying to pull off. And so this is just a puller. I've used it for bouncers before, which again, you know, there's specific tools for it, but if you're not going to reuse the engine, you're just working on something separate, then this is perfect for that. You know, you'll find a lot more reasons to use it than you think, but these are a decent tool, but this is like stage 4 or 5 at this point. You know, this is definitely stage 2, this is stage 3 or 4. You're going to start finding tools that you like that I didn't mention. This is going to be much later in those stages. Now, finally, I do want to go over some tools that are a little bit more gimmicky. These are things you're going to see advertised all over the place, but they're just not that useful. They look amazing. They look like they would be extremely useful, but you're going to find yourself never using it, and you're going to spend too much money on it anyways. So I'll start with this because this is the lowest end of the spectrum. Basically, this is a sort of T that you can use to undo things, and I have 100% used this. I've used this several times when I was in a tight spot, but I didn't use it as it was designed, because you'll see that there's not a lot of torque that you can get if you're holding it with one hand. So you could try with two hands, one hand on each, right, and turn it, but usually you're pretty limited in space. And so because that was kind of the intent, is for it to be this sort of, turning ability, in most places that I can put this, I can put a ratchet. So what I have used it in is I've had it on the far end when a ratchet would be too tall. And so I've had it way at the end, and then I've cranked it. But then you have to reset and crank it again, reset, crank it again. So it was a very one-time use. I've never used it after that. It was just a very specific repair that if I had just a different ratchet, I wouldn't have needed it at all. So again, you'll see these a lot, but certainly not something that you should go out of your way to buy. Similar to that would be something like this. I love the concept of this. Basically, you can use it sort of like a crescent, but it's a wrench, right? And you can change the sizes. And I think if I was stranded on the side of the road, this would be a, take what you can get scenario. But it's kind of like having a boat that's also a car, or a car that's also a boat. It's not going to be very good at either thing, right? Like, yeah, maybe it's a car that floats, but it's probably going to be a bad car, and it's also not going to be a very good boat. This is definitely something that you can use to adjust and, crank whatever bolt that you need to do, but because it's not necessarily a good wrench, it's not going to be the first thing that you grab. And so where do you put it? You put it in, a car that you think might break down, and you'll never use it. So I would not spend my money on this. I'd rather spend decent money on wrenches, and this would be the kind of thing that you buy when you have pretty much everything already. This would be something that you should just never buy. I've seen these advertised all over the place. I ran into a specific issue where I needed to get to something, and I needed to be at a weird angle. This was something I bought before I had the wobble extensions even. And so the idea behind it is that it bends, right? It's this cable. And so you can kind of work at weird angles like this. But it's got several issues. One, if you're at a weird angle like this and you're turning, it's going to naturally want to kind of like flop its way out. So let's say that's hooked there. As I'm cranking it, it's just going to rotate itself out, and it's sort of working against you, right? The other thing is it's made of these wound cables. You'll notice the direction is spinning this way. And so for the most part, you're not tightening with this, right? You're using this because it's a weird area that you need to undo a bolt. But the problem is you'll go ahead and try and undo the bolt, and it'll start to unravel itself. And so as it unravels itself, then it's no longer putting any sort of pressure on this. And so I haven't actually measured the pounds in which it unravels, but it feels like probably 15 to 20 pounds. And so again, unless you're working in the most random scenario where you need to be at an angle, but it's also not on there very tight, but it's a little bit tighter than hand tightened, then this would be the tool for you. So naturally, I haven't found a lot of those scenarios. So just absolutely avoid this. It's not worth it. Get the wobble extensions like I mentioned. Now this I knew I was never going to use, but I kind of like to buy tools that also don't really have a whole lot of function if they're a little funky, a little gimmicky, especially if I can get a deal for them. I go to a lot of car shows, and I just thought that this was kind of an interesting concept where it's a ratchet, and you can use it like a ratchet. You could still crank it as you normally would, but it's got this sort of handle here, and so you can turn it, and if you can get a decent grip on it, you can sort of do that last bit of turning. But for the exact same reasons that I mentioned, this isn't very helpful. There's not a lot of scenarios where I need a ratchet, but it's only tight enough for me to have this tiny grip on, right? Like that's not very much for like leverage or anything. Like that is a little above hand tightening. And additionally, it's got a massive like head on it. And so there's not a lot of places that have that level of room that require me to also barely be able to twist it off. So if I can get a ratchet where this can also go, then I would use a ratchet. Or if I need to work on something where I can only work on it up here, then I would just get like an extension of sorts. So it's essentially the most useless tool I have. I've forced situations for me to try and use it, and it still didn't work better than anything else. And so I have it. I'll probably never actually come to the day where it, does anything, saves any situation. But it's just kind of fun to have. And so, sometimes buying stuff like this, you don't really regret it because it's just goofy and it's goofy. And as long as you know it's goofy, then, no hard feelings. But that is my kind of crash course on tools that you will need if you are going to start doing background or backyard repairs. Just your standard, your very basic entry level stuff to start working on stuff yourself. And then the stuff that's going to make your life a little bit easier. But if you feel that there's other tools that I may have missed that have made your life a lot easier, feel free to comment. I'd love to hear other tools that are useful, or if you have other gimmicky tools that you kind of got suckered into buying and you realize that they don't do anything, or maybe some of these are some of those. Feel free to comment as well. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.